The transport ship Meridian's Edge shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace near Korath Station. Among the hundreds of passengers preparing for disembarkation, one figure sat quietly in the economy section, drawing curious stares from fellow travelers. Zara Chen appeared impossibly delicate for someone heading to the galaxy's most notorious combat training facility. At barely 5 feet tall with a slight frame, pale skin, and dark hair pulled into a simple ponytail, she looked more like a library student than a warrior. Her clothes were plain and practical, her movements careful and precise. When turbulence rocked the ship, other passengers gripped their armrests, but Zara's body moved fluidly with each motion, never fighting the forces around her. "First time to Korath?" asked the burly Thaxian sitting beside her. His species was known for their natural combat prowess, and like many aboard this transport, he was clearly heading to the station's fighting tournaments. "You sure you're on the right ship, little human?" Zara smiled politely. "I'm sure, thank you." The Thaxian chuckled, his tusks gleaming. "Look, no offense, but Korath isn't a place for..." He gestured vaguely at her small frame. "Maybe try one of the cultural exchange programs instead?" Other passengers had overheard and were now openly staring. A group of Zelani fighters whispered among themselves in their clicking language, occasionally pointing in her direction. Even the ship's crew seemed puzzled when they checked her documentation, double-checking her destination multiple times. As the ship docked, Zara gathered her single small bag and joined the queue. The Thaxian warrior still seemed concerned. "Really, kid, Korath Station has fighters from 1,000 worlds. Some of these beings could crush starship hulls with their bare hands. The tournaments there aren't games." "I appreciate your concern," Zara replied softly, "but I'll be fine." The airlock opened, and passengers began filing into Korath Station proper. The massive structure was a marvel of engineering, built specifically to host combat sports and martial arts competitions from across the galaxy. Gravity could be adjusted in different sections to accommodate various species, and the architecture itself seemed designed to intimidate visitors. Zara stepped into the main concourse and immediately felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. The station buzzed with activity as fighters from dozens of species prepared for upcoming tournaments. Massive Korvani warriors practiced devastating punches that created sonic booms. Agile Nexari dancers turned fighters moved through forms that seemed to defy physics. The air hummed with energy weapons being tested and combat suits being calibrated. And there in the middle of it all stood one seemingly fragile human girl. "You lost, little one?" The voice belonged to a Korvani female nearly 8 feet tall, her stone-like skin scarred from countless battles. She looked down at Zara with what might have been sympathy. "The civilian quarters are in Section C. This area is for registered fighters only." Zara pulled out her registration pad and showed it to the warrior. The Korvani's 4 eyes widened as she read the display. This can't be right. It says you're registered for the open class tournament. That's for elite fighters only. There must be some mistake." "No mistake," Zara said calmly. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Word spread quickly through the fighter levels. Within an hour, small crowds began gathering wherever Zara went, simply to stare at the strange sight of such a delicate-looking human in their midst. Some laughed openly. Others expressed genuine concern for her safety. A few seemed intrigued by the mystery. Zara found her assigned quarters in the fighter dormitories, a sparse but functional room with basic amenities. As she unpacked her few belongings, she could hear conversations in the hallways outside. "Can't be serious about fighting. Someone should contact station security. Going to get herself killed in the first round." None of it bothered her. She had heard similar conversations on dozens of worlds, in hundreds of training halls, across years of preparation for this moment. People always underestimated her, and she had learned long ago that their assumptions were her greatest advantage. That evening, Zara made her way to the station's public training areas to observe other fighters preparing for their matches. The spaces were enormous, with different sections optimized for various combat styles. Here, a group of energy-based life forms practiced devastating ranged attacks. There, Mechanical beings tested their hydraulic systems against reinforced targets. In another area, traditional martial artists from organic species worked through forms that had been perfected over millennia. She moved through the areas quietly, watching everything, learning patterns, studying techniques she had never seen before. Her presence continued to draw attention, but gradually the stares became less mocking and more curious. There was something about the way she moved, the way she observed, that suggested she might know more than her appearance indicated. A young Nexari fighter approached her near the end of the evening. His species was known for their incredible speed and agility, and he moved with the characteristic flowing grace of his people. "I'm Kale," he said, extending a hand in the human greeting style. "I couldn't help but notice you studying everyone's techniques. Are you some kind of analyst or strategist?" "Fighter," Zara replied simply, accepting the handshake. His grip was firm but not challenging. Kale's large eyes registered surprise. "Really? I mean, no offense, but you don't look like..." He trailed off, seeming to realize how that sounded. "Like a fighter?" Zara finished with a small smile. "I get that a lot. It's just, well, most humans I've seen are much larger, more muscular, and the successful ones usually augment themselves with cybernetics or genetic modifications. You seem so." He searched for a polite word. "Fragile?" Zara suggested. "I was going to say natural," Kale said diplomatically. They talked for a few more minutes, and Zara found herself liking the young Nexari. Unlike many others she had encountered, his curiosity seemed genuine rather than condescending. When she finally returned to her quarters, she found a message waiting on her communication terminal. It was from the tournament organizers, requesting a meeting the following morning. The tone was formal, but concerned, clearly intended to give her one last chance to withdraw from the competition before embarrassing herself publicly. Zara deleted the message without responding. Tomorrow would bring the first day of preliminary matches, and she was exactly where she belonged. The morning of the preliminary rounds arrived with the station's artificial dawn cycle. Zara woke before her alarm, as was her habit, and began her daily routine. She moved through a series of gentle stretches that looked more like dance than combat preparation. To any observer, it would have seemed impossibly delicate, almost meditative, but those stretches were actually forms from 17 different martial arts traditions, seamlessly blended together. The tournament organizers had indeed requested a meeting, but Zara ignored the summons. Instead, she made her way to the fighter registration desk to confirm her participation. The clerk, a nervous-looking Eldorian with multiple arms, seemed relieved to see her. "Ms. Chen, thank goodness. We were hoping to speak with you before the matches begin. Perhaps we could discuss some alternative competition categories. We have exhibition matches, demonstration events, cultural showcases. I'm registered for open class," Zara said firmly. "That's where I'll be fighting." The clerk's 6 arms fluttered anxiously. "But Ms. Chen, the open class is for the galaxy's elite fighters. Beings who have trained their entire lives, who have augmented themselves specifically for combat. Your preliminary opponent alone is a Vorthak Destroyer-class warrior who has never lost a match." "Then it should be interesting," Zara replied. Word of her stubbornness spread quickly through the fighter quarters. By the time she arrived at the preliminary arena, crowds had gathered not just to watch their own matches, but to witness what many expected to be the shortest fight in tournament history. The preliminary arena was smaller than the main competition spaces, but still impressive by most standards. Adjustable gravity, energy barriers for spectator protection, and medical teams standing by in case of serious injury. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, though much of it seemed focused on morbid curiosity rather than genuine sporting interest. Zara's opponent entered first, and the crowd's reaction was immediate. The Vorthak known as Crusher stood nearly 10 feet tall, his crystalline exoskeleton gleaming under the arena lights. His species had evolved on a high-gravity world with dangerous predators, and their natural physiology made them living weapons. Crusher's forearms ended in bone spurs that could punch through starship armor, and his reputation for devastating quick victories was legendary. When Zara entered the arena, the contrast was so stark that several spectators laughed outright. She looked even smaller standing across from the massive alien. and her simple training clothes seemed almost comically inadequate compared to Crusher's natural armor plating. The referee, a neutral AI construct, announced the match parameters. Standard tournament rules: victory by submission, knockout, or opponent leaving the combat area. No weapons, no external augmentations beyond what was naturally occurring to each species. Fighters ready? The AI asked. Crusher responded with a bone-rattling roar that shook the arena barriers. Zara simply nodded. Begin! What happened next would be debated in fighting circles for years to come. Though it lasted less than 30 seconds, Crusher launched himself forward with devastating speed. All four arms extended to grab and crush his tiny opponent. It was a straightforward assault that had ended dozens of previous matches before his opponents could even react. But Zara wasn't there when he arrived. She had moved the instant the match began. Flowing around his charge like water around a stone, her movement was so smooth it seemed almost effortless, each step perfectly placed to avoid his grasping limbs while positioning herself for what came next. As Crusher's momentum carried him past her initial position, Zara struck. But it wasn't the kind of strike anyone expected from such a delicate-looking fighter. Her small fist connected with a specific point on Crusher's lower left arm, and the massive alien's entire limb went instantly numb. Crusher spun, confused but not yet concerned. One disabled arm was hardly a significant disadvantage for a being of his size and strength. He swung his remaining 3 limbs in a devastating pattern that should have caught any normally sized opponent. Again, Zara simply wasn't where the attacks landed. She moved between his strikes like she could predict exactly where they would be, her body bending and flowing in ways that seemed to ignore the normal limitations of human physiology. Her second strike hit another pressure point, this time on Crusher's right shoulder. His upper right arm locked up completely, joints frozen in position. The crowd had gone silent. This was not how anyone expected the match to progress. Crusher began to show the first signs of real concern. His species was known for their adaptability in combat, and he quickly adjusted his strategy to account for his compromised limbs. He began using his massive legs to deliver kicks that could shatter reinforced concrete, while his remaining arms worked to corner the elusive human. For almost 20 seconds, the arena became a display of incredible movement as Zara flowed around Crusher's increasingly desperate attacks. She seemed to know exactly where each strike would land before he even began the motion, positioning herself in the spaces between his offensive capabilities. But she wasn't just avoiding damage. With each evasion, she delivered precise strikes to specific points on Crusher's exoskeleton, pressure points that most beings didn't even know existed, neural clusters that could be accessed only with perfect timing and exact positioning. When Crusher's third arm went numb, panic began to set in. He had never faced an opponent who could systematically dismantle his physical capabilities without seeming to exert any real effort. His final attack was a desperate lunge, using his entire body weight to try to simply crush Zara against the arena wall. But she read the movement before he committed to it, stepping aside at the last possible moment and delivering one final precise strike to a nerve cluster at the base of his skull. Crusher collapsed instantly, conscious but completely paralyzed from the neck down. The arena was absolutely silent for several heartbeats. Then the referee's voice cut through the stillness. Victory to Chen by technical submission. The crowd exploded. Half the spectators were on their feet cheering. The other half were sitting in stunned silence trying to process what they had just witnessed. In the fighter sections, beings who had been laughing at Zara just minutes before were now staring with new respect. And more than a little concern, Zara helped the medical team position Crusher safely while explaining which pressure points she had targeted and how long the paralysis would last. The Vorthak would recover completely within an hour, with no permanent damage. As she left the arena, fighters who had barely acknowledged her existence the day before now watched her every movement with intense interest. The whispered conversations had taken on a completely different tone. Did you see how she moved? Those weren't human fighting techniques. How did she know exactly where to strike? Kale, the young Nexari she had spoken with the previous evening, approached her as she exited the arena area. That was incredible, he said, his voice filled with awe. I've never seen anything like it. How did you learn to fight like that? Zara smiled, the same small, polite smile she had worn since arriving at the station. Practice, she said simply, and continued toward her quarters. Behind her, the conversations were just beginning. Word was already spreading to the main tournament brackets, where elite fighters were starting to pay very close attention to the preliminary results. The fragile human girl had just announced herself to the galaxy's fighting community in the most dramatic way possible, and her real challenges hadn't even begun yet. News of Zara's victory spread through Korath Station like wildfire. Within hours, fight footage was being analyzed by trainers, strategists, and fighters throughout the facility. Some dismissed it as a fluke, claiming Crusher must have been injured or unprepared. Others recognized something far more significant had occurred. The tournament bracket for the open class featured 64 of the galaxy's most formidable fighters. Zara's preliminary win had earned her a spot in the first official round, where she would face opponents who had already proven themselves among the elite. The difference in caliber between preliminary and tournament-level fighters was enormous. Her next opponent was announced during the evening meal period, Thane Koros, a cybernetically enhanced human who had won championships on 12 different worlds. Unlike Zara, Thane represented the pinnacle of human augmentation technology. His bones had been replaced with titanium alloys. His muscles were fiber-enhanced and his reflexes were computer-assisted. He stood 6 feet 8 inches tall and weighed nearly 300 pounds, all of it optimized for combat. When the match schedule was posted, betting pools immediately opened throughout the station. Despite her shocking preliminary performance, Zara remained a massive underdog. Most observers reasoned that whatever technique she had used against Crusher would be useless against a prepared, enhanced fighter of Thane's caliber. Zara spent the time before her match doing what she always did, observing. She watched Thane's training sessions from the public viewing areas, studying his movement patterns and combat style. His approach was brutally efficient, combining overwhelming physical power with cybernetic enhanced precision. He favored direct assault tactics, using his augmented strength to simply overpower opponents before they could develop defensive strategies. What interested Zara most was not what Thane did, but what he didn't do. His augmentations had made him incredibly powerful, but they had also created dependencies. His enhanced muscles required specific movement patterns to function optimally. His computer-assisted reflexes followed predictable algorithms. He had traded flexibility for power, adaptability for enhancement. During one of his training sessions, Thane noticed Zara watching from the observation deck. He looked up and gave her a smile that was probably meant to be encouraging but came across as condescending. "Don't worry, kid," he called out. "I'll make it quick and clean. No unnecessary damage." Zara nodded politely and continued watching. She remained until his session ended, memorizing every detail of his enhanced combat style. The first round matches were held in the station's primary arena, a massive space that could accommodate thousands of spectators. When fight day arrived, the arena was packed beyond capacity. Word of the mysterious human girl had drawn attention from across the galaxy, and beings had traveled from distant systems just to witness what many expected to be her final match. The pre-fight atmosphere was electric. Massive screens displayed fighter statistics and highlighted Thane's impressive record, alongside Zara's single official victory. The contrast was stark. Thane's bio read like a catalog of military achievements and championship titles, while Zara's listed only her name, species, and homeworld. As the fighters entered the arena, the size difference was even more dramatic than it had been with Crusher. Thane looked like a living weapon, his augmented physique clearly visible beneath his form-fitting combat suit. Diagnostics lights blinked along his limbs, indicating his enhancement systems were active and optimized. Zara wore the same simple training clothes she had used in her preliminary match. She looked even smaller standing across from the enhanced human, and several spectators voiced concern that the match officials should intervene for her safety. The referee, a different AI construct than the one from preliminaries, announced the standard tournament rules. Thane responded by activating his combat mode, and the soft whir of mechanical systems filled the arena as his augmentations powered up to full capacity. "Fighters ready?" Thane's response was a sharp nod, his enhanced reflexes already calculating optimal attack patterns. Zara simply stood quietly, her breathing steady and controlled. "Begin." Thane exploded into motion with inhuman speed, his cybernetic legs launching him across the arena in a blur of enhanced muscle and mechanical precision. His approach was exactly what his training footage had suggested. a devastating direct assault designed to end the fight in seconds. But as he closed the distance, something unexpected happened. Zara moved to meet his charge, flowing forward instead of avoiding it. Her timing was so precise that she slipped inside his extended reach, just as his enhanced arms began their striking pattern. What followed was unlike anything the crowd had ever witnessed. Zara engaged Thane in close-quarters combat, but not in any style the audience recognized. She moved around and threw his augmented attacks like she was dancing with a partner who knew different steps. Every strike he threw, she was already positioned to redirect or avoid. Every movement he made, she seemed to anticipate and counter. Thane's enhanced strength meant nothing if his attacks couldn't connect with their target. His cybernetic speed was useless when Zara seemed to know where he would strike, before his computer systems had finished calculating the optimal trajectory. For the first time in his career, Thane found himself completely outmatched not by superior technology or greater physical power, but by pure technique so refined it seemed almost supernatural. Zara began demonstrating fighting styles that most of the audience had never seen before. She flowed from classical Earth martial arts to obscure alien combat forms, each transition so smooth it seemed like a single, impossibly complex style. She used Altarian pressure point techniques that most beings didn't know existed. She employed Janthari energy redirection methods that were supposed to be impossible for non-telepathic species to master. Thane's augmentation systems began registering errors as Zara's strikes targeted the connection points between his organic and mechanical components. Her attacks weren't trying to overpower his enhancements. They were disrupting the interfaces that allowed them to function properly. The crowd watched in amazement as the most technologically advanced human fighter in the tournament was systematically dismantled by someone who appeared to be using nothing but pure, unaided skill. The end came suddenly. Thane attempted a desperation move, channeling his full augmented power into a single devastating strike. But Zara read the attack pattern, stepped inside his reach, and delivered a precise combination of strikes that simultaneously hit 3 different nerve clusters and 2 cybernetic interface points. Thane's entire augmentation system shut down in a cascade failure, and his enhanced body collapsed under its own suddenly unsupported weight. The arena fell silent again, just as it had after the Crusher match. Then slowly the applause began. It started with a few knowledgeable spectators and built into a thunderous ovation that shook the station's superstructure. Zara helped Thane to his feet as his systems slowly came back online. The enhanced human stared at her with a mixture of amazement and respect. "How?" he asked simply. "Practice," Zara replied, the same answer she had given Kale. But as she left the arena, the fighters and trainers watching from the VIP sections were asking much more specific questions. Some of the techniques she had demonstrated were supposedly lost arts from civilizations that had fallen thousands of years ago. Others were secret forms that were carefully guarded by specific martial arts orders. How had one human learned them all? And more importantly, what other surprises was she hiding? The tournament bracket had been reduced to 32 fighters, and suddenly Zara was no longer viewed as an amusing curiosity. She had become the most dangerous unknown quantity in the entire competition. The real tournament was about to begin. The victory against Thane Koros had fundamentally changed how the tournament viewed Zara Chen. No longer was she dismissed as a naive human who had wandered into the wrong competition. The galaxy's fighting elite now recognized her as a genuine threat, and they began preparing accordingly. Between rounds, Zara found herself the subject of intense scrutiny. Combat analysts studied her footage frame by frame, trying to identify the specific martial arts she was using. Training masters from dozens of species attempted to catalog her techniques, but kept encountering forms they had never seen before, or arts that were supposed to be extinct. Her quarters were now under subtle surveillance, with fighters and their teams trying to observe her training routines. But Zara's preparations remained maddeningly simple. She continued her gentle morning stretches, meditated quietly in the evenings, and spent her time observing other fighters with the same calm attention she had shown from the beginning. The second-round opponent assignments were announced with great fanfare, and Zara's match drew the most attention. She would face Kirix the Untouchable, a Nexari master who was considered one of the greatest fighters alive. Unlike Kale, the young Nexari she had befriended, Kyrix was an ancient being who had spent centuries perfecting the combat arts of his species. The Nexari were natural fighters, their physiology allowing for incredible speed, agility, and an almost supernatural ability to sense incoming attacks. Kyrix had never been successfully struck in over 300 recorded matches. His defensive capabilities were so legendary that many opponents simply exhausted themselves trying to land a single blow. When the match was announced, even Zara's growing number of supporters felt concerned. Kyrix represented a completely different challenge from her previous opponents. Crusher had relied on overwhelming force and Thane had depended on technological enhancement. But Kyrix was pure skill, honed by centuries of experience and natural advantages that no human could match. The pre-fight analysis programs gave Zara virtually no chance of victory. Kyrix's speed would prevent her from using the precise pressure point techniques that had been so effective in her previous matches. His defensive instincts would neutralize her ability to position herself for optimal strikes. Most experts predicted that the match would end with Zara unable to touch her opponent at all. But Zara continued her routine as if nothing had changed. She watched Kyrix's training sessions with the same quiet attention she gave all opponents. She studied his movement patterns, his defensive positioning, his counterattack preferences, and gradually she began to understand something about the legendary Nexari fighter that others had missed. Kyrix's untouchable status had made him predictable in subtle ways. His defensive perfection had been built around centuries of facing similar opponents using familiar techniques. His supernatural reflexes were calibrated to respond to attacks that followed logical patterns and conventional timing. But Zara had learned to fight in ways that didn't follow conventional rules. The match was scheduled for the station's premium arena, the same venue used for championship finals. The crowd was the largest yet, with beings traveling from across the galaxy to witness what many expected to be the end of the mysterious humans tournament run. As the fighters entered the arena, the contrast was striking in a different way than her previous matches. Where Crusher and Thane had dwarfed her physically, Kyrix was closer to her size, though still noticeably larger and more muscular. His species' natural grace was evident in every movement, and his forearms moved in perfect coordination as he performed his pre-fight ritual. Zara's entrance was, as always, unremarkable. Simple clothes, calm demeanor, no visible signs of nervousness or intimidation. She had faced beings who could crush starships and cybernetic warriors who had conquered worlds. The fact that her next opponent had never been touched in 3 centuries of fighting was simply another interesting challenge. The referee announced the match, and for the first time, there was audible tension in the AI's voice. Even the neutral system seemed aware that this contest would determine whether Zara's success had been genuine skill or impossible luck. "Fighters ready?" Kyrix responded with a flowing gesture that was both respectful and confident. His forearms moved in a complex pattern that demonstrated his readiness while simultaneously beginning his defensive positioning. Zara nodded once, her breathing steady and controlled. Begin. What happened next redefined what the galaxy understood about combat sports. Kyrix immediately established his defensive perimeter, moving in the flowing, hypnotic pattern that had frustrated opponents for centuries. His forearms created an impenetrable barrier, while his legs positioned him for optimal evasion or counterattack. It was a perfect fighting form, honed by endless experience and natural talent. Zara approached differently than anyone had ever approached Kyrix before. Instead of trying to penetrate his defenses or outlast his stamina, she began to fight with him rather than against him. She moved into his defensive space and began matching his rhythm. Her movements synchronized with his patterns, creating what looked almost like a collaborative dance. But within that synchronization, she was subtly disrupting his defensive flows. The crowd watched in fascination as the two fighters moved together in increasingly complex patterns. Kyrix was still untouched, but for the first time in his career he was being pressed to constantly adjust his defensive positioning. Zara wasn't trying to break through his barriers, she was reshaping them. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, she began leading their shared rhythm instead of following it. Her movements started to dictate his responses, drawing him into defensive patterns that felt natural but were actually being guided by her technique. Then, at a moment when Kyrix's defensive flow had been subtly redirected into a position he had never occupied before, Zara struck. It wasn't the kind of devastating blow that had ended her previous matches. It was barely more than a touch, a gentle tap against Kyrix's shoulder that landed exactly when and where his defense couldn't respond. The arena exploded. For the first time in centuries, Kyrix the Untouchable had been touched, but the match wasn't over. Kyrix, stunned by the impossible occurrence, immediately shifted into his most advanced defensive form. His movements became so fast they blurred, his forearms creating patterns of protection that seemed to occupy multiple positions simultaneously. Zara adapted instantly. She had studied not just Kyrix's techniques, but the techniques his techniques were designed to counter. She began using fighting forms that predated the development of his defensive style, arts from species that had fought Nexari warriors thousands of years before Kyrix was born. The second touch came 30 seconds later. A precise finger strike that slipped through guards that had never failed before. The third touch was almost artistic in its perfection, a flowing movement that seemed to pass through Kyrix's defenses like they were made of air. By the fourth touch, Kyrix had stopped trying to maintain his untouchable status and instead focused on simply surviving the encounter. But Zara's technique had evolved beyond anything he could counter. She was fighting with styles from dozens of different species, blending techniques and combinations that shouldn't have been possible for any single being to master. The final touch was gentle, almost apologetic. Zara's hand came to rest on Kyrix's chest, directly over his primary heart, in a gesture that could have been lethal but was delivered with perfect control. Kyrix stepped back and bowed deeply, all four arms extended in a gesture of absolute respect. "I yield," he said simply. The crowd was beyond cheering. They had witnessed history. The Untouchable had been touched not once but repeatedly by a human who looked like she could be broken by a strong wind. As Zara helped Kyrix to his feet, the ancient Nexari spoke quietly. "Who trained you?" he asked. "Everyone," Zara replied. And for the first time since arriving at Korath Station, she offered a genuine smile instead of her polite, professional expression. The tournament had reached the round of 16, and suddenly every remaining fighter was studying her with desperate intensity. Whatever Zara Chen was, she had just proven that the galaxy's understanding of combat was incomplete. The biggest questions still lay ahead. The defeat of Kyrix the Untouchable sent shockwaves through the galactic fighting community that extended far beyond Korath Station. News networks across hundreds of worlds led with the story of the unknown human who had achieved the impossible. Combat academies suspended classes to analyze her footage. Ancient masters emerged from retirement to study her techniques. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from the remaining tournament fighters themselves. The casual confidence that had characterized the early rounds was gone, replaced by intense preparation and barely concealed anxiety. Every elite fighter still in the bracket began studying not just Zara's known techniques, but the fighting styles of species they had never considered relevant to their own training. Zara's next opponent represented yet another completely different challenge. Commander Vex Aldara of the Kaltharan Empire was not just a fighter, but a military strategist who had conquered star systems through combat prowess and tactical brilliance. Unlike her previous opponents who excelled in individual areas, Vex was a complete warrior, whose strength lay in his ability to adapt and overcome any combat situation. The Kaltharans were a proud warrior species, whose culture revolved around military achievement. Vex stood 7 feet tall, his body covered in the ritual scars that marked his countless victories. His fighting style incorporated not just physical techniques, but psychological warfare, environmental awareness, and strategic thinking that could turn any arena into his advantage. What made Vex particularly dangerous was his preparation methodology. Unlike other fighters who relied primarily on physical training, Vex approached each match as a military campaign. He studied his opponents with the same intensity he had once used to analyze enemy fortifications, identifying weaknesses and developing comprehensive battle plans. When Zara was announced as his opponent, Vex immediately began the most thorough combat analysis in tournament history. He obtained every piece of available footage, interviewed previous opponents, and even consulted with experts from the species whose techniques Zara had demonstrated. His preparation team worked around the clock to develop countermeasures for her unprecedented fighting style, but Vex's research only deepened the mystery. The more his team analyzed Zara's techniques, the more impossible her abilities seemed. She had demonstrated mastery of fighting forms that required decades to learn, from species with completely different physiologies. Some of the arts she used were supposedly extinct, known only from ancient historical records. "Sir," his chief analyst reported, "we've identified at least 47 distinct martial arts traditions in her 3 matches. Some of these styles are incompatible with human physiology. Others require psychic abilities that humans don't possess, and several are from species that went extinct before humans achieved spaceflight." Vex studied the data with growing fascination. "What do we know about her background?" "Almost nothing. Her registration lists only basic information. No formal training records, no competition history, no known masters or academies. It's as if she appeared from nowhere." This lack of background information bothered Vex more than any technique she had demonstrated. In his military experience, unknown variables were the most dangerous elements in any conflict. An enemy whose capabilities and origins were unclear could not be properly countered. As fight day approached, Vex made a decision that surprised his team. Instead of developing a specific strategy to counter Zara's known techniques, he chose to approach the match as he would an encounter with a completely unknown alien species. He would rely on adaptability, observation, and tactical flexibility rather than predetermined plans. The arena for their match was configured differently than previous rounds. At Vex's request, the fighting space included environmental obstacles that could be used tactically. Elevated platforms, variable terrain, and adjustable lighting created a more complex battlefield than the simple flat arenas used earlier. The crowd had grown even larger, with spectators now traveling from across the galaxy specifically to witness Zara's matches. The betting pools had become so complex that entire economic analysis firms had been hired to calculate odds on various aspects of her fighting style. When the fighters entered the arena, Vex immediately began his tactical assessment. He noted Zara's positioning relative to the environmental features, her stance adaptation to the varied terrain, and her apparent comfort level with the complex fighting space. What he observed was both reassuring and deeply troubling. Zara moved through the arena like she had trained in it for years, naturally positioning herself to take advantage of tactical opportunities while avoiding potential disadvantages. Her spatial awareness was perfect, suggesting combat experience in complex environments rather than simple arena fighting. The pre-fight introductions highlighted the contrast between the two fighters. Vex's military record was read in full, detailing his conquests across 17 star systems and his mastery of 43 recognized combat disciplines. Zara's introduction remained frustratingly simple: name, species, homeworld, and her impossible tournament record. "Fighters ready?" Vex responded with a sharp military salute, his analysis already complete and his adaptive strategy prepared. He had positioned himself to take advantage of the arena's elevated platforms while maintaining escape routes to every section of the fighting space. Zara stood quietly in the center of the arena, seemingly unconcerned with the tactical complexities that Vex had spent hours analyzing. "Begin." Vex's opening move was unlike anything Zara's previous opponents had attempted. Instead of engaging directly, he used the arena's features to establish positional dominance while studying her responses to environmental pressure. He moved between platforms and obstacles, forcing her to constantly adjust her positioning while he observed her adaptation patterns. It was a sound, tactical approach that had won him countless military engagements. But Zara's response demonstrated why conventional tactical thinking was inadequate against her abilities. She didn't try to counter his environmental strategy or negate his positional advantages. Instead, she transformed the arena into something completely different. Moving between obstacles with flowing grace, she began using the environmental features not as tactical positions, but as elements in an impossibly complex three-dimensional martial arts form. Suddenly, the elevated platforms became stepping stones in an aerial combat technique that shouldn't have been possible in the arena's gravity. The tactical obstacles became focal points for energy redirection methods that turned Vex's positional advantages against him. The variable lighting became an element in shadow fighting arts that most species couldn't even perceive, let alone master. Vex found his carefully planned tactical approach being systematically deconstructed by fighting techniques he had never imagined could exist. Zara was using the arena itself as a weapon in ways that transcended conventional combat thinking. But Vex was not just a tactician, he was an adaptive warrior who had survived battles across the galaxy. When his environmental strategy failed, he shifted immediately to direct engagement, bringing all his military combat training to bear in a devastating assault, designed to overwhelm her defensive capabilities. The resulting combat was unlike anything the tournament had seen. Vex fought with the disciplined ferocity of a military commander, his attacks coordinated and relentless. But Zara met his assault with techniques drawn from warrior traditions that predated his entire civilization. She fought with the flowing water techniques of the ancient Meridiani, species that had mastered combat in zero gravity. She used the geometric precision methods of the crystalline Jarn, whose mathematics-based martial arts had been lost for millennia. She demonstrated the phase-shifting combat styles of the energy-based Luminari, techniques that required manipulation of quantum states that humans weren't supposed to understand. The match continued for nearly 10 minutes, far longer than any of Zara's previous fights. Vex's military training and adaptive capabilities kept him in the contest long after other opponents would have been defeated. But gradually, inevitably, Zara's impossible mastery began to tell. The end came when Vex attempted his ultimate technique, a devastating combination attack that had never failed in either tournament or battlefield conditions. But Zara responded with something that made the crowd gasp in recognition and disbelief. She used the legendary Caltheran Emperor's Blade technique, the ultimate martial art of Vex's own species. Not an approximation or a copied version, but the authentic form in its absolute perfection. A technique that was supposed to be known only to the Imperial Guard and had never been demonstrated by an outsider. Vex stopped mid-attack, his weapons lowered in shock. "How do you know the Emperor's Blade?" Zara smiled gently and touched his shoulder in the ceremonial gesture of defeat that concluded formal Caltheran duels. "I told you," she said softly. "Everyone." As Vex bowed in formal military surrender, the audience sat in stunned silence. She had not just defeated a galactic champion, she had done it using his own species' most sacred fighting technique. The tournament had reached the quarterfinals, and the questions surrounding Zara Chen had moved far beyond simple curiosity. Who was this human who seemed to have learned the martial arts of every species in the galaxy? How was such comprehensive mastery even possible? And most importantly, what other impossible techniques was she still hiding? The quarterfinal victory against Commander Vex had transformed Zara from a tournament curiosity into something approaching a galactic phenomenon. Her use of the secret Caltheran Emperor's Blade technique had sparked investigations by intelligence agencies across multiple star systems. Ancient martial arts masters emerged from centuries of seclusion to offer theories about her impossible abilities. Religious leaders debated whether her skills represented some form of divine intervention or genetic anomaly. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from her quarterfinal opponent, Master Liu Wei, an elderly human who was considered the greatest martial artist Earth had ever produced. Liu Wei had spent his life cataloging and preserving human fighting traditions, and his presence in the tournament represented humanity's highest achievement in combat arts. When the match was announced, it created unprecedented interest across human-settled worlds. For the first time, two humans would face each other in the elite rounds of the galaxy's premier fighting competition. But the contrast between the fighters was as stark as any previous pairing. Liu Wei was 93 years old, his body shaped by 8 decades of martial arts practice. His movements carried the wisdom of countless masters, his techniques refined through lifelong dedication to perfection. He represented the culmination of Earth's traditional fighting knowledge, a living repository of humanity's warrior heritage. Zara remained what she had always appeared to be, a slight young woman whose unassuming presence seemed to mock the very concept of martial mastery. The pre-match analysis took on a different character than previous rounds. Instead of focusing on species advantages or technological augmentations, experts debated the philosophical implications of the contest. Liu Wei embodied the traditional path of martial arts mastery through disciplined practice and gradual enlightenment. Zara seemed to represent something entirely outside conventional understanding. Liu Wei himself approached the match differently than her previous opponents. Instead of studying her footage for tactical advantages, he meditated on the deeper implications of her abilities. During his final preparation session, He was observed performing forms that hadn't been seen in competition for centuries, drawing on the most ancient human fighting traditions. When reporters asked about his strategy, Liu Wei's response was characteristically thoughtful. She has shown us techniques from across the galaxy, arts that took civilizations millennia to develop. But I wonder if she truly understands what she is doing, or if she is simply mimicking what she has observed. The question revealed the central mystery that had puzzled observers since her first match. Zara's technical execution was flawless, but her understanding of the deeper principles behind each martial art remained unclear. Did she comprehend the philosophical frameworks that had given birth to these fighting styles? Or was she simply reproducing movements without grasping their meaning? The semi-final arena was configured as a traditional martial arts space, free of the environmental complications that had characterized recent matches. Liu Wei had requested the simple setting, explaining that true martial arts were about the interaction between fighters, not the manipulation of external factors. The crowd for this match included representatives from every major martial arts tradition in human space. Ancient masters who rarely left their monasteries had traveled to Korath Station, specifically to witness this unprecedented encounter between traditional mastery and inexplicable ability. When the fighters entered the arena, the contrast was immediately apparent. Liu Wei moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his entire life in pursuit of martial perfection. His pre-fight routine was a demonstration of classical forms, each movement precise and meaningful. He embodied the culmination of human fighting tradition. Zara's entrance was, as always, unremarkable. But for the first time since the tournament began, she seemed to show a hint of uncertainty. Her usual calm confidence was replaced by something that might have been nervousness or possibly reverence. Liu Wei completed his preparation routine and bowed deeply in the traditional manner. "I am honored to face you," he said formally. "Your abilities have amazed the galaxy, but I wonder if you understand the weight of what you carry." Zara returned the bow with equal formality. "I understand more than you might think, Master Liu, but perhaps not as much as I should." It was the first time she had given anything approaching a substantive answer to questions about her background or understanding. The referee announced the match, and both fighters assumed traditional stances. For the first time in the tournament, Zara's opening position was recognizably human, drawing from classical earth martial arts rather than alien fighting forms. "Begin." What followed was unlike any of Zara's previous matches. Instead of immediately demonstrating exotic techniques from distant species, she engaged Liu Wei using purely human martial arts. The opening exchanges were a dialogue of traditional forms, classical movements that had been refined over centuries of Earth's fighting history. Liu Wei responded with increasing complexity, testing her knowledge of human fighting traditions. He flowed through techniques from dozens of different schools, each transition a question about her understanding of Earth's martial heritage. Zara answered each test perfectly, not just with correct movements, but with the subtle variations that revealed deep comprehension of underlying principles. She demonstrated knowledge of forms that most human practitioners didn't know existed, styles that had been lost for generations. As the match progressed, Liu Wei realized he was facing something unprecedented. Zara wasn't just mimicking human martial arts. She was demonstrating mastery that exceeded his own. She knew techniques that had been lost to history, understood variations that existed only in ancient texts, performed methods that had been theoretical rather than practical. But more than that, she was beginning to synthesize different human fighting traditions in ways that created something entirely new. She blended internal and external methods, soft and hard techniques, ancient and modern approaches with perfect harmony. Liu Wei found himself being pressed not by alien fighting techniques or impossible abilities, but by human martial arts elevated to a level he had never imagined possible. The realization changed his approach to the match. Instead of testing her knowledge, he began engaging with her as a fellow master, exploring the limits of martial possibility. Their combat became collaborative rather than competitive, each fighter pushing the other toward greater understanding. The crowd watched in fascination as the two humans moved together in increasingly complex patterns that seemed to transcend individual fighting styles. They were creating something new, a synthesis of human martial arts that incorporated the best elements of every tradition while maintaining perfect technical execution. The climax came when they simultaneously attempted the same legendary technique, a form from ancient Chinese martial arts that was supposed to be impossible to perform in actual combat. Both fighters executed it perfectly, their movements synchronized in a display of martial artistry that brought the audience to their feet in spontaneous applause. They separated and stood facing each other, both breathing hard but neither clearly victorious. Liu Wei smiled and bowed deeply. "You have shown me something I have searched for my entire life," he said. "The perfect synthesis of our martial heritage. I yield not because you have defeated me, but because you have taught me." Zara returned the bow with profound respect. "Thank you, Master Liu. You have reminded me why these traditions matter." As they embraced in the center of the arena, the crowd understood they had witnessed something far more significant than a tournament match. They had seen the meeting of traditional mastery and transcendent ability, resulting in a moment of pure martial artistry. The tournament had reached the final four, but the question surrounding Zara had evolved beyond simple curiosity about her abilities. Her match with Liu Wei had demonstrated that her mastery went far deeper than technique alone. She understood the philosophical foundations of fighting arts, the cultural contexts that had shaped them, the spiritual principles that gave them meaning. But how had one person acquired such comprehensive understanding? And what did her presence in the tournament really represent? The answers would come in the final rounds, where Zara would face the two most formidable opponents in the galaxy. The final four of the open-class tournament represented the absolute pinnacle of galactic combat achievement. Alongside Zara stood three beings whose fighting abilities had become legendary across known space. Zirath the Destroyer, an ancient energy being whose very existence was a weapon. Primal One, the first and greatest of the cybernetic warrior race, and Most High Kazakh, the reigning champion whose species was unknown and whose fighting style had never been categorized. The semi-final draw placed Zara against Zirath the Destroyer, while Primal One would face Most High Kazakh. The Yadur winners would meet in a final match that was already being called the most significant sporting event in galactic history. Zirath represented a challenge unlike anything Zara had faced. As a pure energy being, Zirath had no physical form to target with pressure points or leverage techniques. Its attacks came as focused energy bursts that could disintegrate matter at the molecular level. Previous opponents had either been overwhelmed in seconds or had fought defensive battles that ended only when Zirath chose to stop toying with them. The preparation period before the semi-final was unlike any previous round. Galactic media coverage had reached unprecedented levels, with analysis teams from thousands of worlds providing commentary on every aspect of the upcoming matches. Academic conferences were convened to discuss the implications of Zara's abilities. Entire research institutes were established to study her fighting techniques, but Zara herself remained as enigmatic as ever. She spent the preparation time in quiet meditation, declining all interview requests and avoiding the crowds of spectators who had gathered hoping for glimpses of the mysterious human. Her only public appearance was a brief training session observed by fellow competitors, during which she performed gentle movements that revealed nothing about her strategy for facing an energy being. When match day arrived, the arena had been specially configured for combat with non-physical entities. Energy dampeners and containment fields created a safe environment for spectators while allowing Zirath to manifest its full combat potential. The fighting space itself was enlarged to accommodate energy-based combat techniques that required significant room to develop. The crowd was the largest in tournament history, with beings from across the galaxy gathering to witness what many believed would be either Zara's greatest triumph or her inevitable defeat. Energy beings were considered the ultimate fighters, their mastery of fundamental forces giving them advantages that no physical entity could match. When Zirath entered the arena, reality itself seemed to bend around its presence. The ancient being appeared as a shifting column of pure energy, constantly changing between different electromagnetic spectrums while radiating power that made the arena's safety systems strain to contain it. Zara's entrance was, as always, understated, but as she walked toward the center of the fighting space, observers noted something different about her movement. Her steps seemed lighter, almost weightless, and the air around her showed subtle distortions that suggested she was somehow manipulating local energy fields. The pre-fight announcements took on special significance when Xerath's history was read. The being was thousands of years old, had participated in the destruction of entire star systems, and had never been defeated in any form of combat. Its energy manipulation abilities were so advanced that it could restructure matter at will, and existed simultaneously across multiple dimensional planes. When the referee called for the fighters to prepare, Xerath's response was a pulse of energy that briefly overloaded every electronic system in the arena. The display was both a demonstration of power and a psychological tactic designed to intimidate any opponent. Zara stood quietly in the center of the arena, her breathing steady and controlled. But careful observers noticed that the energy distortions around her had intensified, creating subtle interference patterns in Xerath's energy emanations. Begin. What happened next redefined what the galaxy understood about the relationship between matter and energy. Xerath's opening attack was a focused beam of pure destructive energy that should have instantly vaporized any physical target. But instead of dodging or attempting to shield herself, Zara moved directly into the energy stream. The beam struck her and simply dispersed. The energy flowed around her body like water around a stone, its destructive potential somehow neutralized without any visible defensive mechanism. The crowd gasped in disbelief. No physical being had ever survived direct contact with a Xerath's energy attacks, let alone absorbed them harmlessly. Xerath, puzzled by the failure of its primary weapon, intensified the assault. Multiple energy beams struck Zara from different angles, each one capable of destroying a starship. But the result was the same. The energy flowed around her, through her, and dissipated harmlessly. Then Zara began to move, and the audience realized they were witnessing something that challenged fundamental understanding of physics. She was fighting using energy manipulation techniques that shouldn't have been possible for a matter-based life form. Her movements created standing wave patterns in local spacetime. Her strikes generated focused gravitational fields. Her defensive positions bent electromagnetic radiation around her like a cloak of invisibility. She was demonstrating the fighting styles of energy beings, arts that were supposed to be impossible for physical entities to learn or perform. Xerath found itself facing an opponent who matched its abilities in every regard while possessing physical advantages it couldn't counter. The ancient being had never encountered anything like Zara's hybrid approach to energy combat. The match became a display of forces that most spectators couldn't even perceive properly. Energy patterns too complex for physical senses interacted with gravitational manipulations that bent local space. The arena's safety system struggled to contain effects that operated outside normal physical parameters. But gradually, Xerath's attacks became less coordinated, its energy patterns more chaotic. Zara's impossible technique was somehow disrupting the ancient being's fundamental coherence. The end came suddenly. Zara executed a movement that appeared simple, but generated a resonance pattern that perfectly matched Xerath's energy frequency. For a moment, the two fighters existed in perfect harmony, their energy patterns synchronized. Then Zara shifted the resonance slightly, and Xerath's coherence collapsed. The ancient being's energy form scattered across the arena before slowly reforming into a diminished version of its previous self. "Impossible," Xerath whispered, its voice like distant thunder. "You fight as we do. How can a material being manipulate energy as an energy being does?" Zara looked up at the scattered form with something that might have been sadness. "Because everything is connected," she said softly. "Energy and matter, consciousness and form, past and present. The divisions are illusions we create to understand what we cannot comprehend." Xerath's form stabilized into a configuration that conveyed deep respect. "You are not what you appear to be," it observed. "None of us are," Zara replied. As Xerath formally yielded, the arena fell into a silence deeper than any previous match had produced. The audience had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of reality itself. But the tournament was not over. In the other semifinal, Primal One had defeated Most High Kazakh in a brutal contest that had lasted nearly an hour. The final would pit Zara against the greatest cybernetic warrior ever created, a being that represented the ultimate fusion of technology and combat ability. As Zara left the arena, reporters and analysts struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed. Her victory over Zerath had demonstrated capabilities that seemed to transcend the normal limits of physical existence. Questions about her origins had evolved beyond simple curiosity into something approaching existential concern. Who was Zara Chen? What was she? And in the final match against Primal One, would the galaxy finally learn the truth about the fragile-looking human who had mastered every fighting style in known existence? The answers would come in 24 hours in a final match that would determine not just the tournament champion, but possibly the nature of reality itself.